Hello everybody, Happy New Year and welcome to another episode of Is It Worth It? Where I review novels across all genres and let you know which are worth your time. I hope you took the long weekend to get started on your 2021 reading list. I sure did. I'll actually have a review of my first completed novel for 2021 up and on the channel next week. But this week, I wanted to take a minute to go back in time and focus on one of the top-selling psychological thrillers from the 2010s. That is The Dinner by Herman Koch. A story about two brothers and their wives who go out to dinner to catch up, but also discuss a disturbing event from their past that may be coming to surface and ruin a lot of their present endeavors in the process. This was a really interesting premise for a novel, one that I was particularly interested in upon reading the jacket copy. I also saw that this was going to be turned into a major motion picture, which did not quite get the best reviews, but the novel itself has been critically acclaimed worldwide, published in 25 different languages. This was a story that seemed like you needed to read it if you were into psychological thrillers. The book does have a lot going for it. For one, I will say that this is a really solid character study, both when considering the mentally ill and nature versus nurture. When we talk about character studies, we're typically talking about stories that are extremely character driven. The plot is basically there to shape a character's identity and allow them to grow or change throughout the course of a story. The best example in recent years that I can think of that a lot of people will be able to relate to is The Joker featuring Joaquin Phoenix. That is an incredible character study that really focuses on one character alone. It's very difficult to do this in stories that are told in third person. You really have to be able to get into the character's mind, and you have to be able to do that for the entire duration of the story. The Dinner certainly does that. We focus on Paul, our protagonist here, and Koch does a really nice job of painting Paul's character in different lights throughout the story that by the end gives us an entirely different perspective on who this character is than we initially believe. I'll keep the details regarding the nature versus nurture situation to myself to keep this a spoiler-free review. But just know that when we talk about these different elements in storytelling, it's very difficult to get them right. Moreover, it's very tough to keep readers engaged after reading, especially when it comes to psychological thrillers. I think that term is thrown around way too carelessly nowadays. By definition, a psychological thriller does focus on the psychological aspects of a character and the inner workings of the mind as they go through the motions that come to play in a story. But I also think that there's something to be said about the way it affects the reader and allows their mind to keep working after they're finished reading. I can only think of a handful of novels that do this exceptionally well, especially over the last 10 years, and The Dinner is certainly one of them. When I finished reading this story, I found myself perplexed, I felt myself disturbed, and I was certainly not done thinking about it once I closed the book after reading the last page. The concept behind this story is also genius. So many thrillers could be narrowed down into a shorter landscape. You know, some of these psychological thrillers nowadays that take place over the course of 2 years could easily be whittled down to a 2-month span that makes for a much more fast-paced and condensed story. Koch takes the opposite approach here and tells an entire story over the course of one evening, an almost 300-page endeavor. As you can probably guess, there's a lot of flashbacks in play, there's a lot of dialogue in play, and there's a lot of inner monologues in play here to flesh out an entire story over the course of a mere couple of hours. Sometimes this works, sometimes this doesn't, but the premise behind it is so unique that it doesn't surprise me fans of the psychological genre would be willing to pick up a copy of this novel without knowing much about it, considering the format presented. Something else I want to note is how Koch's decision to tell this story from the first-person perspective pays off big time. There's been a lot of debate in the writers community regarding first person versus third person, specifically when we're talking about thrillers, especially psychological thrillers. Psychological thrillers are notorious for having unreliable narrators, and it's very difficult to tell a story from an unreliable narrator's viewpoint when you tell it in the third person. Third person limited does give you some of this capability, but first person really does give you more flexibility in that regard. However, when you tell a story from first person, a lot of times you're sacrificing the ability to build other characters. When you have so many flashbacks intertwined with a present day story, the first person narrative can get a bit confusing. I thought this was the case in The Dinner, but by the story's end, I realized just how important it was that Coke tell this story from the first person. Again, not going to get into too many specifics there, but should you read this novel, you will see what I mean, even if the first 50 to 100 pages feel a bit unorthodox. And by the way, speaking of endings, The Dinner has one of the best endings I have read in a psychological thriller. A lot of times psychological thrillers end with either a pretty bow that tries to wrap everything up and ultimately leaves the reader feeling disappointed, or it ends with a forced twist that also leaves the reader feeling disappointed. The point is, a lot of times psychological thrillers end with disappointment. This might just be a personal opinion of mine. Maybe as a fantasy writer, I'm more inclined to enjoy the endings that come with multiple volumes in a series, endings that tie up loose ends that were brought up thousands and thousands of pages ago. Psychological thrillers sometimes try a bit too hard to do this in such a short span of time. The Dinner, however, does an exceptional job of bringing things full circle when we reach the conclusion of this story. I'm probably not finished saying this today, but I'm going to leave the details out in case you want to read it yourself. But I will say, if you're looking for a fresh take on the psychological thriller genre with an incredibly thought-provoking ending, this might be the book for you. However, I'm not sure the ending, as great as it is, makes up for the flaws presented throughout the course of the story. Maybe this was because I was expecting more coming into this. Maybe it's because the jacket copy is some of the best jacket copy I've read for a story in quite some time. Maybe it's because the premise is so different from anything we've seen in a thriller these past 10 years. But I actually found the story extremely underwhelming. I mean, the idea for the novel is superb. Centering an entire novel around a dinner that is more or less a front for a deeper, more intriguing, more disturbing conversation is an incredible idea that sounds really difficult to pull off without suffering a few hiccups here and there. But Coke more or less does it. However, his intention to stick with that promise leads to a story that feels rather long-winded. And that's saying a lot for a novel clocking in at under 300 pages. I will note that the final third of the novel is extremely fast-paced, but the first 2/3 of the novel are not. A lot of that could have been removed or summarized in a much more concise manner. There are times within the first 150, 200 pages of the novel that I found myself very, very bored. That's not exactly what you want your readers to feel when they're trying to get into a story. Speaking of that more or less disturbing, deeper conversation that needs to be had at dinner, which turns out to be the main conflict, the whole situation felt a bit chaotic. I guess this is somewhat intended given the nature of this conflict, and the writing style reflects this, but whether or not it's his intent, I found Coke's style really messy. There's a lot of bouncing back and forth between the past and the present. There's a lot of jumping in and out of Paul's mind at unorthodox times. There's no question that Coke makes the right decision to tell this in the first person, because if this was told in the third person, I can't see a world where I would have understood what was happening in the third act. Specifically regarding the conflict, on the whole, it works. It makes sense. It also sets up the reader for the psychological debate that is sure to come when they finish the story. That said, I found the present conflict that turns out to be the main motivator of these characters a little far-fetched. The motivations of these characters comes off a bit drastic. Some, if not most of this, does come to fruition in that final act. It does make sense by the end of the story, but a lot of the tension is left up in the air without any explanation for way too long throughout the story, for big portions of the novel. And since Coke waits too long to explain the motivations behind his character's actions, we as readers feel disconnected from the present situations. We feel detached from what's happening here, and that is a problem that we don't really get to face until we're almost finished this story. This is both the case for the plot and for the characters. And I'm not just talking about our narrator, our protagonist, Paul. I'm talking about the other parties at the dinner and the characters mentioned and who play a role outside of the dinner. Because we don't really know what's going on in Paul's head early on, because there's this sort of forced mystery surrounding Paul's past, his present, and his motivations, he comes off as a rather unlikable character. He's pretty irritable, he plays the poor me card, and since we don't really know why, at least not truly, it's tough for us to relate with him on any real level. The same can be said for the other characters too. So much of what is said at this dinner comes with an underlying truth that we are not aware of until later in the story. Therefore, some of what they say is confusing, but mostly it's just annoying. I felt like Coke tried just a bit too hard here to keep the truth from us. It makes for an incredible ending, but it makes the journey getting there a bit insufferable, therefore making this long-winded read even tougher to get through. So, is it worth it? I don't think so. Not if you're looking for the next Gone Girl, which is what a lot of readers will assume they're getting when they see Gillian Flynn's book cover blurb posted at the bottom of the cover art. Maybe this was part of my issue too. I thought this book was going to be different than it was, and that's not to say it's not different. Like I said, this story is certainly a different endeavor in the psychological thriller genre. But I thought the stakes would be a bit more realistic. I thought they would be a bit more relatable. I thought the characters would interest me kind of in the same way that Nick and Amy Dunn do in Gone Girl, even though they're unlikable. If you're looking for a thought-provoking thriller, then this one might be up your alley because it is deeper than many of the other thrillers released nowadays. But I have to warn you, the action's limited, the characters are duds, and the main conflict is suspect at best. And given the lack of these rather important elements in a thriller, especially in 2020 when tons of thrillers are released on a monthly basis, I would personally suggest looking elsewhere for your next great read. Thanks so much for joining in on this week's edition of Is It Worth It? Really excited to kick off the new year with you guys. If you're looking for some reads that I do recommend, definitely take a look at some of my previous videos where you will find books that I highly, highly recommend, especially if you're fans of the fantasy genre. Next week, we take a look at one of the biggest hits from 2020, and we figure out whether or not it's right for you. Thanks a lot, guys.